Hey, my name is Chris Brennan, and you're listening to the Astrology Podcast. In this episode, we're going to be talking about the astrological forecast for October of 2024. Joining me today is astrologer Austin Coppock. Hey, Austin.
Hey, Chris.
And so, for the first hour of this episode, we're going to talk about news and events that have happened in the world over the past month since our last forecast and what their astrological correlations were. And then the second half, in the second hour, we're going to jump ahead and do a deep dive into the astrology of October and all the crazy stuff that is coming up over the course of the next 4 weeks. So, as always, there will be timestamps either below this video on YouTube or on the podcast website if you want to know when to jump ahead to just the forecast section if you want to skip the news. But otherwise, yeah, let's get started. So I want to give a brief overview first of the astrology of October before we jump into the news segment, just to give you a preview of what we're going to be talking about in this episode. This is the planetary movements calendar that shows where the planets will start at the beginning of the month and then how far through the signs of the zodiac they'll get by the end of the month. Next, we have the astrological transits calendar that was designed by Madeline Decotes of honeycomb.co, where you can actually go to download this graphic for those watching the video version. And this just shows some of the different graph with some of the different aspects that will go exact during the course of the month, and especially the different parts of the month where we can see that there's some clusters of a bunch of aspects going exact at once, especially, for example, earlier in the month around the time of the eclipse or mid-month around October 13th and 14th. We are still right in the middle of eclipse season. So we had our first eclipse season earlier this year in March and April. And right now we are right in the midst of eclipse season in September and October again, with our next eclipse coming up in Libra on October 2nd. So this is a diagram that Madeline and I were putting together from honeycomb.co just to show how things really ramp up and how the orb of eclipse is about a week on either side, but that in the middle between the two eclipses, you're still in this very intense sort of eclipse zone, so to speak, which is what we find ourselves in today. We are also starting the Mars retrograde shadow period on October 4th, so the ramp up to that begins when Mars hits 17 degrees of Cancer. And finally, here's the planetary alignments calendar. So the main thing that happens at the top of the month is October 2nd. We get a solar eclipse in the sign of Libra, which is a major one. It's our last eclipse in that sign of Libra for the next 10 years. Then a few days later, Mercury squares Mars on the 6th of October. Jupiter stations retrograde in Gemini on the 9th. Pluto stations direct in Capricorn for its final station in Capricorn of the century on the 11th of October. Mercury moves into Scorpio on the 13th. The Sun squares Mars on the 14th, and the same day, the Sun actually trines Jupiter as well. Then we get our second lunation of the month, which is a full moon in Aries on the 17th, and the same day, Venus departs from Scorpio and moves into the sign of Sagittarius. The following week, the Sun moves into Scorpio on the 22nd, and at the end of the month, Venus squares Saturn on the 28th, and the Mars-Pluto opposition is building up and is within 3 degrees at this point by late October, and it will go exact in the early days of November. So that is some of the astrology that we're going to be talking about during the course of this episode. But let's start first by talking about news and events. Most of the major news stories focused on eclipse season this month, since we already had the first eclipse on September 17th, which is a lunar eclipse in the sign of Pisces. And as we've really focused on and talked about a lot over the past year on the podcast, eclipses have this most intense range that starts about 7 days before the eclipse, about a week before the eclipse, and about a week after. So that means our most intense eclipse range began around September 10th and lasted until around the 24th, 25th, so to give or take. So in terms of news stories, the very first news story with that actually happened at the very beginning of that range on September 10th. So the first thing was that the presidential debate took place between Kamala Harris and former President Trump, and this eclipse took place in Harris's 10th house of career, reputation, and social standing, and she ended up winning the debate. Just, I think everybody pretty much agreed, whether you're for her or against her by the end, so that it ended up being a triumph for her, and then the polls went up in her favor afterwards. after that eclipse took place. So it was a really striking manifestation of an eclipse in a person's 10th house.
And so this was in her 10th, and this was on the North Node, or Rahu, or the dragon's head. And something that I see quite commonly with eclipses on the dragon's head, um, is that there will often sometimes there will be so you say, a jump to a new level that people didn't think a person was capable of, or a surprising or ambitious move. And not commenting specifically on the debate here, but sometimes you see people get in over their head, or they're like people. It looks like it's taking on a new thing. You think of the dragon's mouth and taking a bite out of life, and often it's a new level, or sometimes it's biting off more than you can chew. Sometimes it's being able to function at a higher level than, or under more pressure than you or other people thought you could. And I think in the 10th, that's a pretty good example, because I try not to follow the electoral politics too closely for my mental health. But it was my understanding that people were surprised by her performance, that they were surprised that she rose to that level and took a bite out of it.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely trepidation given how badly the debate went for the Democrats in June with Biden's performance and how much that swung things, and people then realizing that this debate, unlike previous debate seasons where people commonly say that debates don't shift, elections, since we
Mhm.
just had a debate where it did, and a candidate dropped
Right.
out almost as a direct result of thing, there was a lot of nervousness about how this would go. Yeah, but she really stepped up to the plate and rose to the occasion in this instance, I think is what a lot of people saw, which is definitely a 10th house eclipse manifestation sometimes of rising to the occasion. So some of the things that happened, she ended up baiting him like a few times, and he kind of freaked out and started talking about just nonsense about people eating cats and dogs. And he did get fact checked a few times, which is interesting manifestation of the Mercury Saturn opposition, Mercury opposite Saturn and Neptune by sign, because we had actually talked about that in the last episode and how we thought that tension between those two would be Mercury and Virgo is like reporters attempting to fact check things when there's misinformation that's being spread around with Saturn conjunct Neptune and Pisces and the inherent tension between those two. So some of afterwards, he wasn't happy about being fact checked by the moderators, but then Democrats were also not super stoked that he ended up talking longer, that the moderators gave him more time to talk throughout the debate in the end as well, so that nobody was fully happy with the moderation. So he was kind of crushed so badly that he's currently dodging another debate. So it's not clear if there's going to be another presidential debate or if that will be the only one. But it's interesting if that is the only one, just that it coincided so closely with that eclipse. And now we're looking towards the next vice presidential debate that's about to take place on October 1st. And that's literally the day before the Libra eclipse that's about to take place on October 2nd. So having both of them occur so close to eclipses is notable. And we've been saying for months, I think since the year ahead forecast, that we expected these debates to be crucial because we saw that they were going to occur so close to eclipse season. So it's interesting to see that actually play out here.
Yeah, definitely. And you made an interesting statement that often debates don't seem to shift things with elections, or that is commonly said, but not true this year. There seems to be a lot that's normally true that's not true this year with this election.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we're supposed to normally in any other election, we're supposed to be having three debates between the presidential candidates. So even the loss of that, of seeing these two go head to head, sort of like intellectually on a public stage, isn't happening. And that debate that we just had may be the only sort of one of that we get as a result of Trump this cycle. But we'll see what happens since there's been another debate proposed for later in October by the Harris campaign and by CNN. So we'll see if Trump changes his mind and like does it and relents and does it after the VP debate, and just depending on how that goes. So, in other news, in the middle of the month, it was around the time of the eclipse, there was a second assassination attempt on Trump on September 15th. This is just 2 days before the Pisces eclipse that took place on the 17th, which was in Trump's eighth house. And the main transit that I noted for him is just that transiting Uranus stationed retrograde at 27 Taurus, and it's retrograding back. So it's very closely square his Mars still in the first house. And I think that's one of the reasons that things like this have been coming up more from an astrological standpoint, is just that close configuration between Uranus and his Mars, which was activated most closely over the summer when there was a Mars-Uranus conjunction in Taurus. But that outer planet transit is still present and still doing stuff there in his chart right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's just worth reiterating that the transiting Uranus, which is squaring his natal Mars, is just sitting on top of his midheaven. So it's on an extremely active angle in his chart. It's not just a Uranus Mars square.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So that was major. And then he also like announced like a cryptocurrency thing, which I thought was interesting, that's supposed to be run by his sons, which is another manifestation of the eclipse in his eighth house. And he was having a transit of like Venus to his Jupiter at the time, which rules his eighth house and his fifth house of children. So with the election, that eclipse was like a final important turning point, because Harris has Saturn transiting through her 10th house right now. And so that eclipse was going to activate not just her 10th house, but was also going to emphasize that Saturn transit through the 10th. And there was a real question of whether the Saturn transit would be a barrier to what she's trying to accomplish right now. And the outcome of the debate was really going to be pivotal in terms of telling us how that transit was doing, and what sort of obstacle or how much of an obstacle it would have or put in her path at this point. But in terms of where it's at this point, the two strongest indications that we have two indications in favor of Harris and one indication in favor of Trump. The two in favor of Harris are that eclipses are taking place in her angular houses, especially her 10th house, which is that Pisces eclipse that just took place. And every presidential candidate over the past 30 or 40 years that's had an eclipse happen in one of their angular houses around the time of the election has won. So in terms of eclipses, it seems like she has it in favor of her. And then in terms of the other indication is the zodiacal releasing, where her Time Lord periods, both on level 1 and level 2, are very positive and very eminent for her at this point, which we've talked about on previous episodes. Trump has one strong point in favor of him, which is that he's going to start a major zodiac releasing Time Lord period, but not until April. So it's kind of curious because his chart does become more prominent for some reason early next year. But it's not clear if that's, him doing something else that brings him into prominence, even if the election doesn't go the way that he wants it. But that's sort of the breakdown right now in terms of two of the main things that we've always looked at in terms of elections. There's a number of other stuff like, transits on election day, inauguration charts, and all sorts of other stuff like that. We did go into a bunch of that in an episode of the Secret Astrology podcast through our page on Patreon. So if people want a more detailed breakdown, they can look to that. But otherwise, we'll be looking forward to seeing how the VP debate goes and how some of the other transits play out over the course of the next few weeks.
Yeah, fascinating. What a un I was going to say what an unpredictable set of events this election has held so far. And yeah, we managed to get at least we get some of them, but and you've done a great job, but so many twists and turns. It will be really interesting to see how this plays out.
Yeah, well, the big thing that we're going to talk about in the forecast episode is the Mars-Pluto opposition. Like, that's going to be crucial for the election and for everything that happens in between election day and inauguration day. And that's a pretty nasty combination. So we have a lot of trepidation about it that we'll get into later in this episode, since that aspect is really going to come into close alignment starting in late October. So we'll talk about that more later in the episode. In other news, Israel and Lebanon, there was another major eclipse story where for months now we'd been anticipating that the next chapter in the saga, ongoing saga of what's happening with Israel, um, would take place under this eclipse season because everything started a year ago around the time of the first Libra eclipse in October of 2023. Then the next stage was the next set of eclipses in March and April, and that's when Iran and Israel started having open, direct conflict for the first time, with missiles being shot from Iran into Israel. And then now, what happened is the very day of the Pisces eclipse on September 17th, Israel set off explosives that were hidden in pagers and other devices that injured something around 3,000 people in Lebanon. And this seemed to be the opening sort of like attack in a what's like turning into a full war now between Israel and Lebanon, which has heated up since then. And now they're saying that they may be preparing for a ground invasion of Lebanon, which it's almost looking like may coincide around the time of that Libra eclipse that's about to take place in early October. So we're seeing the conflict there widening and becoming bigger, and there's a lot of nervousness about this turning into an even bigger regional war than it already was.
Yeah, one of the yeah, it was pretty striking to see that that happening on the day of the eclipse, and then on the next day and the next day. One of the things that I thought was sort of interesting was that so I'd been looking at Iran's chart for a while, thinking about the difficulties in the region and the future. And so when that eclipse, leading up to that eclipse, I was curious about how the fact that the eclipse in late Pisces being right on top of Iran's Mercury, natal Mercury and Mars, if we're using the April 1st, 1979 chart, would manifest. And so it's interesting that the event, like the pager attack, um, did not occur in Iran, but on Iran's Mercury. And this was in that we're looking at communication devices. We're certainly looking at Mercury being the vector for the attack. So it's interesting to me that the astrology seemed to point towards the connections between Hezbollah and Iran just in the chart. And that it also suggests that, it plays into that eclipse playing into Iran's chart plays into the escalation of hostilities, which I'm sure all would prefer did not happen, but looks like it seems in large part inevitable at this point.
Yeah, well, that was one of the things that really came up earlier this year, especially around the time of the Aries eclipse, when there started being that direct and open conflict between Iran and Israel. And that'll be something we'll have to look towards for the next set of eclipses, because this is going to be the final Libra eclipse here in October, but then there will be one last eclipse as part of this series, which will take place early next year in Aries, although with this new conflict with Lebanon really accelerating on the Pisces eclipse, it's tricky because since that's the first eclipse in that series, it could be opening up a window of another series of eclipses that's going to follow through in the subsequent ones in that axis of like Pisces and Virgo. One
Yeah,
of one
yeah,
of the
the
things that I noticed that was notable is that on September 27th, Israel killed the head of Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah. And that was not too long after the Pisces eclipse. And I pulled up his chart, and it turns out that he was born just before a Pisces lunar eclipse. So it was another instance that we've seen so many of over the past year, especially with this conflict, of people that are born under eclipses having sometimes really important turning points in their life happen subsequently under eclipses, like in that instance.
Yeah, and yeah, it's important to note that that eclipse it literally foreshadows another 2 years of eclipses. I don't think we'll be done with the Virgo Pisces eclipses for, I think the last ones occur exactly almost exactly 2 years. And so the nodes, the head and the tail of the dragon, haven't moved into Virgo and Pisces yet. But we get a taste, a quite literal foreshadowing with this eclipse that occurred in mid-September. And then for the one that occurs in early October, we'll be in the process of finishing up what we've been doing for the last year and a half. But we'll be our next set in the spring will be will excuse me, will feature an eclipse in Virgo, and then we'll be in that cycle. And so some rather dire foreshadowing.
Yeah. So we'll be paying close attention to what happens on the Libra eclipse that happens on October 2nd, because we've been tracking that all along because we know it's tied in with very closely, not with just the sequence of events, but also specifically with the birth chart of Israel, which has Libra rising, and with Netanyahu, who has a stellium in Libra and was born the day of a solar eclipse in Libra. So we'll have to see what happens there in terms of what this final Libra eclipse is all about and how that marks an ending for things, but also a new beginning, which is always our keyword for eclipses, like a major endings and major beginnings. So we'll see how that plays out over the course of the next couple of weeks. All right, so moving on to other news. Another major eclipse story that happened right on the eclipse was the downfall of Diddy, who's the famous rapper, music producer, and music mogul. He was arrested on September 16th, which was the day before the Pisces eclipse. And then after he was arrested, the indictment was unsealed on September 17th, the very day of the eclipse, where he was charged with heading a criminal enterprise that was involved in sex trafficking and forced labor. So this is just another major example of this theme, this trend that we've seen over the course of the past year of like a downfall of prominent people around the time of eclipse season. And actually, not even just the past year, the past few years, we've noted this that some of the symbolism of the eclipse, which used to be directed towards like kings and queens in ancient times, and still is in some instances where those still exist, but the modern equivalent oftentimes is like the downfall of a prominent person. And one of the things that I thought was interesting that I noticed is that I remembered that his houses were raided like 6 months ago, but I looked back and it turns out that his houses were raided by the Department of Homeland Security on March 25th, which was the exact day of the last Libra eclipse. So it means that like his houses were raided and a bunch of evidence was collected on the last eclipse. And then on the next set of eclipses, he was actually arrested and imprisoned, and they're currently denying him bail. So it's like that may be it in terms of him being in jail now for the rest of his life.
Yeah, and it's very interesting that not only do we have this eclipse timing, but him being arrested on this one, on the Pisces one, is significant because he has the nodes in Virgo and Pisces. And so this foreshadowing one, this is the first one, this is the first eclipse on his eclipse axis, right? This is the beginning of the nodal return for him. Which is a significant year and a half long set of eclipses that everyone gets about every 19 years, every 18.6 years. And so again, the dire foreshadowing.
Yeah, the biggest thing that I noticed, we don't have a time chart for him, but in his chart for that day, in the first half of the day, Mars is at 29 degrees of Capricorn. It does ingress into Aquarius, so it's possible that it's in Aquarius if he was born in the second half of the day. But I just think it's incredibly striking because Pluto has just retrograded back into Capricorn over the past few weeks, and it's going to station there at 29 Capricorn this month. And if he was born in the morning, then that means Pluto's stationing exactly on his Mars, which sounds like is a pretty rough transit. And it's more important in his chart because his Sun and Mercury are in Scorpio. His Sun, Mercury, and Neptune are all in Scorpio, so they're actually ruled by that Mars. So, being arrested and having your downfall take place for past crimes, especially ones, involving like sex trafficking and things like that, seems like a really fitting Pluto transit to one's Mars. And it's striking how closely that lined up.
Yeah, absolutely. That was the first thing I went to as well. It's worth noting there that with Pluto going over the Mars, when Pluto goes over a planet in the natal chart, you kind of have one of two very different but related effects. One is to hide things or to secret them away where something becomes invisible. And then the other, which we're seeing here, is the disgorging of what was hidden before. It's sort of like the underworld vomiting out its contents. Like all of these awful secret things are coming to the surface.
Right, from like the underworld, so to speak.
Yeah, yeah, you get the opening of the hellmouth, and the like, oh God, all of that happened, right? All of
Yeah.
what was hidden becomes visible.
Yeah. So it'll be interesting to see what happens this month when Pluto stations in Capricorn right on top of that Mars. And just, when the full reality of what's happened sort of sets in for him over the course of the next few weeks. So there was also another major downfall of a prominent person where the mayor of New York City, Eric Adams, was also indicted around the time of the eclipse, and that was another example of like a famous person and experiencing a downfall around that time. So we'll have to pay attention and see what happens with other things, other people when this next eclipse takes place over the course of the next week or two. Moving on, one other eclipse story was footage from the Ocean Gate Titan submarine wreck was released for the first time. They actually sent uh, like a automated submarine down to the bottom of the ocean, and they found the wreck. And pictures were actually released on September 17th, which was the day of the Pisces eclipse. And I thought that was really striking because it kind of confirmed what we had said that this Pisces eclipse was going to do in some instances, which is that it was going to accentuate, but also bring light to the Saturn transit in Pisces that's been happening over the course of the past year and a half. And of course, that submarine disaster was one of the major things that happened the first time that Saturn stationed retrograde in Pisces about a year ago. And that was the major event that everyone was like talking about that week. So it's interesting to see it come up again in the news and to actually see the wreckage for the first time on the Pisces eclipse.
Yeah, absolutely. It was very striking. And I stumbled across another similar revelation about a wreck. Researchers found the wreck of it was SS Erebus, which was sunk, I believe, in 1826, with all souls lost, and their bones were recovered from it, and a lot of it was very similar. The nature of the tragedy was understood better, and it was so perfect symbolically that you have Saturn and Neptune in Pisces with this lunar eclipse. And so with Saturn, Neptune, Pisces, we have the oceanic symbolism, but Saturn like down at the bottom, tragedy, death, also history in this case. And the Erebus, of course, Erebus is named for the god of primordial darkness, the darkest region of Hades in the ancient Greek cosmology. And so we have that quality. Not only is the bottom of the ocean normally dark, but we have this nodal symbolism, right? This eclipse symbolism where things are darker even than normal, right? And so I thought it was a very appropriate sort of paired undersea discovery.
Yeah, that's incredible. Um, so yeah, that continues just our theme, and it'll be interesting to see then how that picks up as we move deeper into this Pisces eclipse series next year. which may continue to emphasize that even more. So, in other Pisces eclipse related news, not too long after the Pisces eclipse, Hurricane Helene hit a bunch of states in the United States. And for some places, it was the biggest storm in a century. Where, for example, there was over like 400 roads that were closed in Western North Carolina, for example. There were some cities like Asheville that are just completely underwater at this point. And it's tricky because it's hit a bunch of rural areas and like small towns. So I think the full extent and like scope of the devastation from that isn't even fully known yet, and it is still being we're still like finding out more and more.
Yeah, it's a brutally literal iteration of an eclipse with a malefic in a water sign, like all this damage being done through airborne water. When I was looking through global news, I noticed that there were actually there were a slew of water-based tragedies this month. There were floods with significant death tolls in Europe, in Nigeria, in India. There were a number of tragic deaths of people trying to cross the English Channel, and there's a very serious typhoon in East Asia that claimed a lot of lives, like right around this Pisces eclipse zone.
Yeah, so it's crazy how literal that can be sometimes, as we saw earlier this year, for example, when there was the Mars-Saturn conjunction and there was that bridge collapse, for example, that occurred, as well as some other flooding and water-related disasters around that time as well. Sometimes the astrology can just be surprisingly literal.
Yeah, shockingly.
Yeah. All right. Moving on, another major news story that occurred that was more like in sort of celebrity news was that, and I thought it was notable because we had just talked about him on the previous forecast, but Kendrick Lamar was announced to be the performer, the headliner at the next Super Bowl, which is going to take place early next year. So this was announced on September 8th, and I thought this was notable because it was right after Mars went into Cancer on September 4th, which is right into Kendrick's 10th house, which we talked about earlier this year when he was famously in that rap battle with Drake. And Kendrick has his a Mercury and Mars conjunction in the 10th house in the sign of Cancer. So we had used him as like an example of that in our previous episode when we were talking about Mars and Cancer. And what was interesting to me astrologically is that once he was announced to be the headliner, there was a bit of a controversy that broke out about whether, um, because the Super Bowl is going to take place in New Orleans, whether a local New Orleans rapper should have gotten it to headline since it would be their hometown, and especially that Lil Wayne was a prominent rapper who's very well known as being from New Orleans, and a lot of people were saying that he should have gotten it. And I thought that was so interesting because it was a very Mars and Cancer type of dispute in terms of having a dispute about like hometowns and who's from where and who has the right to like represent different places and different things like that.
Yeah, and it's so Mars in Cancer, right? Like it's Mars in the domain of the moon. You know, Cancer is about origins. It's where are you from, like who raised you, what does home mean, and representing and being connected to origins, right? And it's Mars in Cancer brings up what is almost always like a martial line, right? Which is, or excuse me, a line not to cross, which is like leave my family out of it. Like, don't say that about my mom. Like you like very often, even in otherwise brutal contests, the moon and Cancer, like all of those significations are off limits, right? But with Mars in that place, it stirs that stuff up, right? Which can be hometown pride, also, as well as some more aggressive things that come out of that. And so it's interesting to see somebody who has that just sort of accidentally stir that up. It's I've been trying to study Mars and Cancer in preparation for the fact that we're going to do a lot of Mars and Cancer this year. And having an infant has actually been really helpful for thinking about that. Because again, with Cancer and with the moon, we're talking about that like most primordial, basic, fundamental, like substrate of feeling and of need. Um, and the sort of pre-verbal the pre-verbal fight or flight need for survival, and because you see that getting triggered when Mars is in Cancer, and somebody threatening your home, your family, et cetera, does that. And so you get some of the overreactions that Mars in Cancer is famous for. But also just seeing a baby, like it's not like they say, hey, you know what, I could maybe go for a snack, right? Like there's a ferocity to the hunger of an infant, because they don't know that the food is coming until like the food arrives, and it's a matter of survival, right? And we all, most of us are not operating on the 5 or 6 month old level, but we're layered on top of that. Like that's still there at the bottom.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it also over the past month, it brought out this Mars and Cancer brought out this weird string of like racism and especially like nativism and all these attempts to scapegoat like immigrants and stuff like that was a real dark side of that that seemed to become particularly prominent this month. And that was part of what was surrounding all of the memes about the false claims about immigrants like eating pets and different things like that, as sort of the darker side of what you're talking about there.
Yeah, no, I mean that's very on topic. Like, yeah, the ferocious nativism.
Right. So, let's see. One last thing with this was just, we'd noted how earlier this year, Kendrick was sort of like engaging in the battle with Drake, but he put a red line down and he basically said like, do not like family is off limits. And it was when Drake crossed that line that Kendrick really brought out the big guns and brought out the killing blow, basically. And I thought that was so interesting because there was another example that was sent in by a listener as I was preparing for the third house this month, where the famous soccer player Zidane, back in 2006, in the final game of his soccer career, um, it's at the biggest game of the year. It's at like the World Cup, and the teams are tied 1-1, and they're like in overtime basically. And then what happens is this other player walks by Zidane, and Zidane has a Mercury Mars conjunction in Cancer in the third house of siblings. And this other player walks by Zidane at this point, and then he says something. It's not fully documented, but he basically insults Zidane's sister in some way. And then Zidane turns around and he just like brutally headbutts this guy with his full body, like in the chest, and knocks him down to the ground. And then he gets a red card, gets thrown out of the game for his final game of his career, and his team ends up losing. But I thought it was so interesting, and as another example of what we're talking about in terms of Mars or Mercury Mars and Cancer. And for him, it was like his family and specifically having his sister insulted.
Yeah, that's a perfect example. Another example, or another like piece of why that's a perfect example that you see with Mars in its fall, or planets in their fall, is that they tend to not obey the rules. Like that's the equivalent of like a low blow, right? Insulting someone's family is against the rules, right? Or like that's a low blow. And then striking the other player illegally, right? Or legally according to the rules of the game. Like um yeah, like taking the moral low road is often a part of Mars in its fall,
Mhm.
right?
Caitlin,
Which isn't always ultimately morally wrong, but like it's not taking the high road, right? Where you're like, well, I'm not going to be dragged down to that level, right? You're like, well, fuck it, I will wrestle with you, I will headbutt you in the mud, right? And but
yeah,
that's the energy of like like that's the reason, or it's part of the reason we have that vertical metaphor with a planet's exaltation and fall, is like I'm going to try to rise above, or like fuck it, I'll get down there with you, right? And I'll show you.
yeah. Well, and that in Cancer, it's ruled by the moon, and just like you going doing your initial action based on the emotional impulse of how that hits you versus Mars in Capricorn having some restraint and like strategy and like planning surrounding how one reacts to something, especially with acts of aggression.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, yeah,
So
operating from that.
so Caitlin Coppock in the chat points out, made a very good point that the big song that amped up the intensity of the rap battle earlier this year was titled Family Matters. So just
Oh,
tying in those themes once again in terms of the Mars and Cancer stuff. So we'll have to pay attention to and see how that, works out over the course of the next several months because we have a lot of Mars and Cancer ahead of us. So I'm sure we'll be talking about this more. All right, so moving on to other news. This just happened a few days ago, but on September 25th, we got poped. The Pope put out an attack on astrology on September 25th. Let me share the actual tweet. It was just like this just a bizarre tweet that came out of nowhere. It was actually the day of the Mercury-Neptune opposition in Virgo and Pisces, but Pope Francis said, our secularized world is teeming with magicians, occultism, spiritism, astrologers, and satanic sects. If we kick the devil out the door, he tries to return through the window. If we overcome him with faith, he seeks to return through superstition. So obviously, this didn't go over super well on Astro Twitter with all the astrologers. One of my favorite responses was actually Ali Alumi, who pointed out that um, that previous popes had used electional astrology in order to found like major parts of the church in Rome and create major buildings there. And my response that I thought of immediately upon hearing this is just the very first book of the Christian Bible, of the New Testament, opens with a story about how God supposedly sent an astrological omen to announce the birth of Jesus, and then that a group of astrologers actually followed that in order to find him and became some of the first to pay tribute to Jesus in that story and in that narrative. So, yeah, this is, there's a lot of different responses that one could have, but for me, it was also a little bit just eerie and made me a little nervous as potential confirmation of something I've been nervous about for a while now, which is if astrologers would receive more pushback as the Saturn Neptune conjunction gets closer to going exact. And I feel like we've seen little hints of that, little instances, and now we have like the Pope himself kind of taking a shot at astrology.
yeah, it seems precisely on schedule to me because it's not only Saturn coming for Neptune, and we know that Neptune in Pisces, which has been the last 13 years ish, um, has um, has had astrology and magic and related things sort of ugh, become more popular, and more people have been interested in them and engaged with them than I don't know, maybe any time in the last century. The 60s would have been the last time there was a meaningful intersection between sort of mainstream culture and astrology. And this one might outstrip that, but it at least rivals it. And so I and you and probably a lot of other astrologers have been wondering about what comes after Neptune and Pisces, because it's very obviously been correlated to that. And of course, we have Saturn escorting Neptune out of Pisces, which should theoretically and now in practice is giving us a firmer boundary or between this sort of high point and what comes next, which I don't expect to be bound to a stake and burned alive. But this sort of condemnation makes a lot of sense, especially with the eclipse just a week before this statement by the Pope, right? Like the North Node eclipse just amplifying that Saturn Neptune energy, right? So we get some of that. I would also add that in addition to um, Christian stories having divinely sent heavenly omens, there's also just all of Thomas Aquinas. There's already like Catholicism is already thought through the relationship to astrology, and the result was not that it's Satan. Like Saint Thomas Aquinas deals with astrology extensively, and basically comes to the conclusion that one, it's real and can be useful and is licit. If as far as mundane astrology goes, you're allowed to look at the weather and look at like the direction of kingdoms. His particular quarrel that became the like central problem or conflict point between Catholicism and astrology was that if there were claims of like total predestination made, that like you are just going to live according to your birth chart and there's no wiggle room or choices, then that wrecked the central drama of salvation, where there's no such thing as salvation if there are no choices to make. Right. If there it means there are no moral choices, it means the whole thing is pointless. And so that excessive predestination around natal astrology was the core of the problem, not that astrology came from the devil and was a fake trick from the Satan. So,
Yeah, I mean, I think, the most important thing is there's just nothing that inherently means there's been many famous Christian astrologers in history, and there's been
sure.
many famous Christians that have incorporated or used astrology in some way. And there's no inherent reason that Christianity has to be against astrology. People make those choices, and um, there's different arguments you could make for or against, but fundamentally, I think, it'd be helpful for astrologers who are Christians to make the case for how astrology can still play a role in your life that is still in agreement in terms of the theological precepts of Christianity. And I think not only have people done that in the past, but people will continue to do that in the future. It's too bad the Pope has taken that position there, but yeah, we'll see how some of those discussions go in the future and how this continues to evolve in terms of our community.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So, in more positive news, I had, there's some sort of feeling I need a hashtag for it when there's like a birth time that you really want to get, and then you finally get it, and just the state of euphoria when you finally get to look at the chart. So, we finally got Sean Evans' birth time from Hot Ones, where SZA went on Hot Ones recently in the episode that was just released in the past week, and she asked Sean what his rising sign was and what his placements were. And he said he didn't know, but he knew he was born at 9:40 in the morning, I believe is what he said. So he actually gave out his birth time, and his chart is amazing and it fits what he does just absolutely perfectly. So here's the birth chart. And the main thing that I noticed, the first thing that I noticed is that he has Cancer rising. Aries is on the 10th whole sign house, along with the degree of the midheaven, along with Mercury being in Aries in the 10th house. And then the ruler of the 10th house is Mars, which is exalted in Capricorn in the 7th whole sign house, the place of one-on-one relationships. And it's a date chart. Um, and I just think that's so hilariously literal because it means the planet that represents his career in the chart is placed in the part of the chart that represents one-on-one interactions with other people, and that the planet is Mars in a day chart, which is a planet that like is fiery and hot and burns things and is irritating. And he's literally like burning the people that he's interviewing on a daily basis during the course of this interview, which is just such a perfect manifestation. I couldn't imagine it being any better symbolically.
Yeah, it's so good. And in addition to that, we have the sun, excuse me, the moon Saturn conjunction in Sagittarius in the sixth house. So the moon is the ruler of his rising. So the moon is Sean, and then Saturn is the ruler of the seventh. So Saturn is whoever Sean is talking to in a one-on-one way, and you have those directly like right next to each other, right? So you have this really close one-on-one suggested, and it's in a fire sign, right? So it's in a fiery place in the sixth, which means that it's a fiery place which threatens health and well-being. So you have this meeting in a fiery, fiery place that may not be good for your health, like between self and other. Um,
Yeah, and
like, come on.
what's crazy is I looked up the first episode of Hot Ones, and Saturn was like right there in early Sagittarius. So him starting this show was actually part of his Saturn return, which I thought was interesting because it's in the sixth house of work. And he's working for Complex magazine when they set up this show and started it, which is a very sixth house thing. But also it made me immediately think of also just the fact that some of the health implications of that with Saturn going
Yeah,
through the sixth house,
right.
which also represents one's health, and just if there's been any complications with that in terms of eating such extremely spicy things on a weekly or almost near daily basis for a period of time. And if that gives you like an ulcer or something like that, was something I sort of thought about in terms of that being activated there.
Yeah, it's so good. It's so good.
Yeah. The last thing that I will note is, of course, as I've talked about, when I put out that call for asking people to ask him his birth time in the August forecast, I noted famously that he was born just after a lunar eclipse in Scorpio, which is conjunct Pluto, and that he was born the day of the Chernobyl explosion, which is just so incredible symbolically. That he was born the day of like a nuclear meltdown, and then he grows up and hosts a interview show where he's just constantly eating super spicy, painfully hot wings with like nuclear imagery on the side of them. But what was further interesting is that when I looked up the first episode of Hot Ones, it turns out that um, he started the first episode just after or around the time of eclipse. There was a Pisces eclipse around the time of that first episode. So he continues to be, he's another eclipse story, basically, of somebody born on an eclipse, and then he starts the show that he would become famous for at the time of an eclipse.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so good.
And I forgot to mention, like, that's what's funny about that combination is that you have Cancer rising as well, like
Hmm.
in a day chart, but your Mars is in the ninth house, and you're giving spicy predictions on a monthly basis, and sometimes subjecting people to dark metaphors or Marsy metaphors. Whereas Sean is literally like burning people with hot sauce on a daily basis with Mars in his seventh house, and that's like his job.
No, it's true. Yeah. It's more of yeah, spicy or yeah, like a prognostic meat grinder for me in the ninth.
Right. Yeah, I love it. So shout out to SZA because that was amazing. She really, helped us out there, and it's amazing having people that can like go on a show like that and just ask the host directly. My jaw literally dropped. So thanks to everybody who sent that in. I had seen it on my subscriptions because I subscribed to the show as a fan, but I hadn't watched it yet. And then everyone blew up my phone saying I had to check it out.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah. All right. That is actually the end of the news section. I don't have anything else to mention, so shall we wrap up this section, take a little break, and then transition into the forecast?
Absolutely.
All right, I wanted to give a shout out to our sponsor for this episode, which is the Northwest Astrological Conference, which is taking place next year in person near Seattle, May 22nd through the 26th, 2025. And it's happening both in person physically as well as being simultaneously streamed online to a virtual audience who want to attend from far away. Registration for NORWAC opens on October 1st. And it's important because the earlier you get tickets, the cheaper it is, where basically the ticket prices go up every few months between now and NORWAC. So it's not one of those things where if you're thinking about attending either in person or online, it's always better to get the tickets early, both because the in-person tickets sell out, but also because the price goes up, especially if you buy them like right before the conference. So this year, there's going to be more emphasis on the virtual component, where there's going to be a special virtual guest workshop by Richard Tarnas giving a 2.5 hour pre-conference workshop. There's also going to be a daily virtual Q&A with NORWAC speakers, an in-person live stream hosted by Nicholas Polomenakis, as well as virtual parties. For the people that are attending in person, Lisa Scheim is actually giving a pre-conference workshop, a full day pre-conference workshop before the full conference begins, like right before it opens, which is going to be amazing. And there's going to be also workshops and other lectures given by many people who have been on the podcast in the past, many names that you might recognize, like Demetra George, our boy Patrick Watson, Gemini Brett, Adam Ellenboss, Nina Griffin, Laura Nalbandian, Kira Sutherland, Ann Ortili, Ali Alomi, Christopher Renstrom, Samuel F. Reynolds, Bear Rivers, Wendy Stacy, Jen Zart, and many, many more. So you can see the full speaker list as well as lecture descriptions to see what talks are going to be presented, or you can get registered for the conference at norwac.net. So this is going to be amazing conferences here. So definitely check it out and check out the website for more information so you can see the full layout of like how many people are speaking and how many lectures are happening. I think there's like 5 or 6 lectures happening simultaneously, something like 4 or 5 times a day over the course of that week. So it's quite an experience.
Yeah, it's a buffet. And I mean, we've both been to probably at least a dozen NORWACs each.
Yeah, at least.
Yeah.
NORWAC was my first conference and is still my favorite conference because some conferences get like gigantic and sprawling, but NORWAC is always in the same hotel and it's this hotel with this very like centralized layout. So it's fun to like bump into people and to have more of like a community feel.
Yeah, absolutely. There's yeah, that hotel has become I have like nostalgic feelings about that hotel. You know, I come
Yeah,
yeah.
I remember many conference nights of staying up late into the night where it's just like me, you, or like Kelly are the last persons that are still up. And that's actually how we started doing the forecast episodes was Kelly and I like stayed up at a conference at a NORWAC and then like had so much fun that we came back and decided to start doing forecast episodes. So NORWAC is tied into the very history of the podcast and the very DNA of the podcast.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So I appreciate that they're trying to integrate the online component more, especially for those of us that can't attend in person. So it's a great thing to take advantage of, and they continue to integrate more interactive components for people that aren't there in person. So it should be really good. Find out more information at norwac.net, and I'll put a link to it in the description below this video on YouTube or on the podcast website in the entry for this episode. All right, my friend, let's transition into talking about the astrological forecast for October. And let's just jump right into it. This is going to be quite the month because even though we're in the midst of it and we've been in eclipse season, it's like the first shoe dropped on the first part of eclipse season, but now the second shoe is about to drop right at the beginning of October with this next solar eclipse happening in the sign of Libra on October 2nd. And I have to say, in terms of configurations to the eclipse, it's not the prettiest looking eclipse because as soon as the eclipse happens, the sun, moon, and Mercury all apply to a square with Mars in Cancer very shortly after that, so that the square with Mars is the primary signature of that eclipse, which in terms of world events does not sound great, given that Mars is the planet of like war and violence and aggression and anger and different things like that.
Yeah, it's really rough. The eclipse is rough and it starts off the month on a tone that is unfortunately quite appropriate for most of the events of the month. That the Mars we not only have the eclipse being square to that Mars, but we have the growing Mars-Pluto opposition all month. Um, let's see. So how do we want to take apart this eclipse? Um,
I mean, one of the things I want to emphasize is just, eclipses are sometimes a series of events, and they represent a series of events over the course of around a year and a half long period. And especially with this one, it's been a pretty clear year of eclipses in Libra, where we had the first one in October of last year, just 1 year ago now. Then we had the next set, which is a lunar eclipse in Libra at the end of March. And then now we have the third and final installment. And, it's not the best example because it's so dark, but like, for example, um, how Sean Combs, how Puffy how Diddy, had his house raided on the Libra eclipse that occurred 6 months ago, and then, was actually went down and was arrested and probably imprisoned for life now under the next set of eclipses. That was just a good illustration about how eclipses are like a process sometimes
Yeah.
rather than a singular thing that happens. And so the fact that this is the later part of a sequence means that for many people, the story of these eclipses should already be clear, and that you're coming to a culmination of events of both ending some things in your life in that sector of your chart that it falls, but also planting the seeds for some new beginnings in that area at the same time. So I saw somebody who said that they broke up with somebody, they ended like a long-term relationship recently on the Pisces eclipse, but sometimes when that happens, that relationship has to end, but then the person will like later start a new relationship, which wouldn't have occurred if that previous one hadn't been let go of. So I think that's what we have to think about as the primary thing to keep in mind for this eclipse.
Yeah, this is the last eclipse in Libra for a very long time, for about a decade. So on that note, right, and sort of addressing that from a different angle, we have roughly a year and a half that the nodes will be transiting a pair of houses in the chart or a pair of signs. And it is the nodes not existing, but being this very special point of intersection between the Sun, Moon, Earth system, right? They in Vedic astrology they're called shadow planets, right? Because they don't have bodies, but the bodies that they have are made of shadow, right? So you can't see them unless they're right in front of the sun and the moon. And so the nodes naturally being invisible, right? Invisibility is their normal state, represent processes and series of events that are usually below the threshold of visibility, like there are processes running in the background. That this could be psychologically, this can be subconscious changes. This in the external world, this can be things happening behind the scenes. But then they have these moments, the eclipses. Every 6 months, on average, you'll have three sets of eclipses for every time the nodes go through a pair of signs, where the invisible becomes visible and all the stuff that had been brewing comes to the surface. It's like a season of television where it's silent, like every episode is completely silent and dark except for the season premiere, the mid-season finale, and then the season finale. And it's just like you can barely see what's happening between those episodes.
Yeah, that's a perfect analogy. Well, and harkening back to the earlier story with like Sean Evans doing the first interview with Hot Ones on an eclipse, like sure they didn't know that that was going to become like this wildly successful thing over the course of the next few years. And in the same way, eclipses sometimes you'll start a new beginning, which just seems really humble at the time, and that you oftentimes like won't recognize as being hugely significant until you look back on it in retrospect and realize that you started something that would come to play a major role in defining your life from that point forwards. So that's where the hidden or the shadowy eclipse symbolism comes in as well, is sometimes the change in your life is not even fully perceptible or recognized.
Yeah, yeah, and that like the contrast between dramatic visibility, like a full moon, and then sudden invisibility. Oh my God, it's the full moon. Where'd the moon go? Like the contrast from like the something out of nothing and then the something into nothing, right? Like, and so with the something into nothing is, oh, it's something bright like the sun or a full moon that that gets sort of stained and then disappears, right? And that's where that's very core, or the sun in the middle of the day, where you have a person in the past, a royal or imperial figure, And these days we have people who have a similar amount of attention as well as what kings and queens remain. Like suddenly their star, their star is shadowed and falls from the sky, like Diddy. But you have that rise and fall from power, or somebody coming out of nowhere, right? Like the dragon which has been slumbering for hundreds of years emerges from the cave. You're like, shit, I didn't know that cave had a dragon. This changes things. And
Yeah. Well,
yeah,
unfortunately, I think this with this one, it's going to be a fire-breathing dragon, not the calm kind, just because here's the chart for those watching the video version. So this eclipse takes place at about 9-10 degrees of Libra, and Mercury at the time has just separated from the Cazimi with the sun a few days earlier, a couple days earlier, and then Mars is at 15 degrees of Cancer. So all three of those planets, once completing these conjunctions with each other earlier in Libra, just apply to that square with Mars in the superior position. So there's just some element of the major beginning at this time that's created in the foundation that's created that's not entirely smooth, where the new beginning or the new ending that has to take place happens abruptly, things happen quickly, but also things happen in like a jarring way that can be really unsettling and really, in some instances, like actually painful or difficult to deal with because there's an element of tension and like conflict underlying it that's motivating the change or perhaps resulting from it in some way.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Yes. Yeah, the jarring nature of eclipses, again, it's part of the nature of that something from nothing or something back into nothing, is that it's very quick. And it's quicker than usually we can adapt to or that we had planned for. And so there's very often an element of shock, even if it's a good thing. And I don't think this eclipse is particularly promising for good things, which isn't to say that it won't happen to anybody. But even when it's a positive thing, there's often a little bit of shock or disorientation.
Mm, right. Yeah, and especially earlier in the month, one of the signatures is verbal altercations, verbal combativeness, foul language, and just getting into arguments and things like that because of that applying square between Mercury and Mars, which eventually goes exact around October 5th and October 6th, where Mercury squares Mars at 17 degrees of Cancer. And that's just a real, those are fighting words, I think, is our usual like keyword for that. When Mercury represents the planet of like communication and speech and messages, and Mars is traditionally the planet of war and conflict. So I would pay attention for verbal conflicts around that time, because sometimes you can get in a verbal conflict with somebody where it seems like, it's just something that won't be a big deal, and you'll say what you feel like saying in the moment or in the heat of the moment, and it'll blow over later. But then when something like that happens during eclipse season, sometimes it can set the foundation for a much longer term conflict than you might intend or anticipate. And I think that's even more so the case because at the same time, by October 4th and October 5th, Mars enters into 17 degrees of Cancer, which is the degree that it will later retrograde back to early next year as a result of the retrograde. So as soon as Mars enters into this zone, it's entered its pre-retrograde shadow period, which means you're going to get three transits of that Mars if you have any personal planets, especially around 17 degrees of the cardinal signs.
Yeah, yeah. This eclipse and then the week following, basically, both the Mercury and then the Sun square to that Mars just as and then just after it enters that shadow zone, is really setting themes that we're going to see well into next year. And so, just thinking, and so yeah, kind of thinking about what this looks like and what we would, like some of the shapes of this, right? We've got that Mars in Cancer, which we were talking about earlier, which is that sort of line crossing coming for the family or feeling threatened at that level. And then like the home and family, whatever is like vital and precious and that you care most about being threatened, and then wanting to, and then freaking out or having a freak out reaction to, like that's very Mars in Cancer. And so we see these planets in Libra where, planets in Libra, while planets in Libra, the Libra business is to try to keep things um try to keep the boat from rocking too much, to try to at least maintain equilibrium, even if it's while driving over rough ground, like to try to keep some balance, right? Or at least to try to move things back towards balance. And that is so, or, on a literal, to try to keep the peace, right? It's Libra. To try to keep things fair and fair, balanced, and harmonious and diplomatic. And an eclipse there, by itself, certainly sends the scales wobbling. And then the fact that that happens in an inferior square to Mars, with Mars in the stronger position looking down on that and in such a reactive place, really speaks to a profound challenge to peace, balance, equilibrium at personal and collective levels.
Did I tell you last month the anecdote that Lisa and I found in the second house episode where Arnold Palmer, who like the Arnold Palmer drink is named after, which is sometimes called like half and half because it's like half iced tea and half lemonade, that he has
Mm-hmm.
the ruler of the ascendant in the second house in Libra, and Libra being the sign of the scales, but also the sides
The
of like
half and
two,
half.
half and half, like two sides of anything. I thought that was hilarious. It's such a blow off like piece of symbolism, but it's so funny like how literal again that the astrology can be sometimes.
Yeah, bringing and not having to choose between two delightful drinks, but bringing them into perfect harmony with one another.
Exactly. And Harris was actually talking about that. She was interviewed on a podcast earlier this year. She was asked if she liked astrology or she hated astrology, which is actually funny because the host didn't like astrology and had gone viral for a clip before that. But Harris said she vibed with astrology because her and Doug are both Libras and that they will sometimes like sit down to watch television and have to like choose between like what show to watch and then just end up going to different shows forever and not being able to decide on one thing.
As someone married to a Libra, I have no comment.
Okay, you can't confirm nor
Or
deny that statement.
exactly, that is the
Uh,
balance I need to strike here.
yeah, well, and it's funny because I've seen world leaders, people complaining about world leaders that have heavy Libra placements and saying similar things about them, that they're indecisive and that their indecisiveness is causing like problems in some ways. So I think that's interesting here, but sometimes that indecisiveness can bring conflict. And I wanted to show the honeycomb graphic that Madeline made for Mars just to show you what happens here is it's this shadow degree gets activated at 17 degrees of Cancer on October 4th. And then on February 23rd, Mars comes back to and stations at that degree. So just imagine it's like you have this initial feeling of some sort of like fiery or spicy event in your life that occurs during this first pass of Mars, which is relatively quick, and you sort of think it's over. But then Mars comes back months and months later and connects these two separate like times in your life together by activating the same placement in your chart, especially if you have something around 17 degrees. But that the second time in February, it's much more important and it lasts for a much longer period of time. That's just something we're looking forward to here as part of this retrograde is these extended and drawn out experiences of tension, of spiciness, of sometimes conflict. Other times, though, it may just be a huge expenditure of energy and focus and drive that you end up having to put in more work over a much longer period of time than you think that you will at first. But for some people, that will still be a productive and sort of like important turning point, even if it can be a bit exhausting.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. The sometimes the Mars, or yeah, sometimes the Mars retrogrades, the extended presence of Mars in a pretty limited number of degrees. In this case, it's Mars in the same 23 degrees for 6, 7 months. It's a very long project with twists and turns that requires layers of effort, and which is, yeah, and it's worth noting, once again, that people who were born with Mars retrograde tend to do a lot better during these periods of time. They don't afflict. They're not the same pain in the ass for everyone. I know several people with Mars retrograde who actually finally get a big project done that had been lagging for the previous year and a half during Mars retrogrades.
Yeah, I think I mentioned this on a previous forecast. Nick had found we were doing a study of major podcasters that we had birth times for, and I found we had Alex Cooper's birth time, who hosts the Caller Daddy podcast, which is like the second biggest podcast on Spotify at one point in time. Recently, Nick found that Joe Rogan had a really prominent Mars, and that every time Mars went retrograde, he would have just a major career defining turning point, like starting his podcast and other things like that. So there's definitely people, if you have a prominent, especially well placed Mars, where it'll just be an important turning point for you and a pivot point in your life story. But sometimes there can still be tensions that come along with that. So there's some positive things though this month that I do want to point at different points, even under the tense transits this month. The benefics are coming in and trying to balance things out, and there's some attempt to like smooth things over or to soothe the burn that takes place both from Venus as well as from Jupiter. So early in the month, when some of the like Mercury Mars stuff is taking place, for example, here's October 5th. One of the things that happens is Venus is moving through Scorpio, the middle degrees of Scorpio early in the month, and it makes a trine with Saturn on October 5th, October 4th and October 5th, which is pretty helpful in terms of as far as aspects go. And then after that, just a few days later, it swoops in and forms a trine with Mars with reception. And this is not too long after Mercury has just formed that square with Mars. So there's these occasional instances where you do get the fiery combativeness of certain aspects, like Mercury square Mars, but then immediately afterwards, there's a counterbalancing transit that's attempting to smooth things over or attempting to hold Mars back a little bit and maybe like apply some ointment to the burn so that it's not as bad as it could be or it doesn't smolder as long as it could.
Yeah, it's better than nothing. It's nice to have that help. I think it's still going to be pretty chafy, for lack of a better term. They will be difficult to maintain that Libran balance. But a little ointment is better than no ointment at all.
Yeah, well, it's like because we get that aspect of Venus to Mars, but then also one of our other major aspects this month is that Jupiter slows down and stations for the first time in the sign of Gemini. And weirdly, that happens around October 8th and October 9th. Mercury comes in as the ruler of Jupiter and trines Jupiter from 21 degrees of Libra on the same day. So that's another one of those aspects where just a few days earlier, we get this really tense and combative Mercury Mars square. But then a few days after that, there's a really positive and optimistic Mercury Jupiter trine that's taking place with reception and that's helping to accentuate an already prominent Jupiter that has an exclamation mark next to it since it's stationing there at 21 degrees of Gemini. So for some people, I think that's going to be really helpful. For example, if you have like a personal planet around 21 degrees of the mutable signs, Jupiter's going to be sitting there in that degree for a little bit and helping to give it a bit of a boost. So especially whatever the Gemini house is in your chart, is experiencing a little bit of positive expansion this month, especially those later degrees of the early third decan.
Yeah, and so that's a I think that's a really important dynamic that both Mercury and then the Sun do this harsh square with Mars. And then afterwards encounter a restorative trine with Jupiter. Right,
Right.
Jupiter has a reputation for giving the good, or like cash and prizes, et cetera, et cetera. But just as important is that Jupiter has a remedial or restorative function, right? Like after a difficult thing has happened, then having literally the best aspect to Jupiter, which is a trine, go direct is nice. And it's how should we say, it's nice because we're going to do another hard lunation halfway through the month that is more that is more
Right.
rough things, rough, fiery, high, near lethal capsaicin level full moon in Aries. And so we get this little Jupiter trine, this little but irreplaceable Jupiter trine in between the kind of brutal eclipse and then the excessively spicy full moon. And again, I would like a lot more for restoration. This doesn't make this an easy or doesn't make this an easy, cool, or even sort of mixed bag month. Like it's a hard month, but at least we get a little help in between these lunations.
Yeah, I mean the you can always see the natal exam, especially in natal charts, those times when a person has a really negative transit, but then a positive one at the same time. It always ends up saving them sometimes in the most extreme scenarios. So like in the third house episode that Lisa and I just recorded this past week, I always love to use the example of George Lucas, who had this really terrible Mars transit that was happening in his third house. And he got in this terrible car accident where his car was just absolutely totaled, and it was hit so hard by another car that it flew in the air and spun and then smashed into a tree and crumpled like a can. But the only reason he survived is that he was thrown from the car just before it smashed into the tree. And he was having both a simultaneously really negative Mars transits, but also really positive Venus and Jupiter transits at the exact same time. So it's like you get the really terrible negative event that's life changing, but then you also get the really miraculous, like positive thing that sort of like saves you out of nowhere at the same time, as opposed to the alternative scenario of if you just have negative things, then sometimes it can be like the worst case scenario happening without any silver lining.
Yeah.
So that's really what's happening, especially there in that I'm glad you mentioned the Sun Jupiter trine because that's one of the other most tense aspects this month. It's building up most of the month. The first part of the month is the Sun applying to um, the square with Mars. And that eventually completes right here around October 13th and October 14th. But by the time it gets to 21 degrees of Libra and squares Mars at 21 Cancer, the Sun also basically simultaneously trines Jupiter at 21 degrees of Gemini. So you're literally getting one of the worst transits you can possibly get from Mars to the Sun, and then you're getting one of the most positive transits you can get from Jupiter to the Sun at the same time. So we're going to see people experiencing around that time some extremes of positive and negative, and either sometimes there's this scenario of like the bad thing that happens, but the good thing that helps to balance it out. Other times it's just two things that happen in parallel where you get like one really good thing that happens one day, but also really one really challenging thing that happens at the same time so that they're independent. But there's this question of like whether that balances things out a little bit, even if, though they're not directly like counteracting each other.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's sometimes you have the separate, like, well, a good thing happened here and a bad thing happened there. And so if you ask me what kind of week it was, well, mixed bag, or I guess it balanced out in the end. And then you have the other case that you described, George Lucas being an excellent example, where a bad thing happened, but there was literally a saving grace, which is kind of what we're talking about. A benefic coming in not to negate a difficult thing happening, but to keep it from the worst case scenario.
Yeah,
To,
totally.
in George's case, to make it survivable, because thank God he endured to make that wonderful second trilogy. The world
Hey,
would be a poor place without it.
All right, you're a little older than me. I was younger for the second trilogy. I will defend the second trilogy. I don't want to say to the death, but I can make a spirited defense for, especially in comparison to the third trilogy at this point. I think they're looking better these days.
Yeah, I don't know. I just stopped watching anything Star Wars after I saw the third movie in the second trilogy. Like, was that late 90s, early 2000s? I was like, oh, I don't ever need to pay attention to Star Wars anymore. So I haven't seen any of the new stuff. I George convinced me to quit 20 some years ago.
How dare you? How dare you, my friend? All right, we'll have to have a whole separate, I'll have a separate episode about that at some point. You're gonna get me worked up. Let's go back to the middle of the month where one of our other major transits that happens this month starts to constellate around the same time period that we're talking about, and which is like the 12th, 13th, 14th. You'll see that what happens is that Pluto slows down and stations direct. Here's the date, around October 11th, 12th, and 13th. And what's interesting is like right about the same time, Mercury gets to the end of its trip through Libra and hits 29 degrees of Libra right before it goes into Scorpio. So it basically like squares Pluto. There's a Mercury Pluto square at the same time that Pluto's stationing. So that's really going to amplify and give a microphone to the Pluto station there. And remember, this is the very last Pluto station in Capricorn for the rest of our lifetimes. We've been having Pluto transits since 2008, 2009, and we've had like dozens of stations at this point over the course of the past decade. This is the very last time that any of us are going to experience Pluto going through this sign in this very last station, and then Mercury swoops in order to amplify that. So earlier this year, we talked about the detective symbolism of Mercury Pluto alignments and how sometimes in its best function, it can be like the intrepid detective who's getting to the bottom of things. And I actually had a funny example of that I found when I was researching the third house, which is it turns out that the author of the Sherlock Holmes stories was born with Gemini rising and has a Mercury Pluto conjunction in the 12th house. So I thought that was so perfect because we talked about, and you'd used the example earlier this year of the True Detective series, which I'm glad you mentioned then because I ended up watching it and it was great. But that's the most positive aspect of things is we may see some like investigative reporting that gets to the bottom of or exposes some things, especially sometimes dark things that are buried pretty deep down, coming to the surface at that time with that Mercury Pluto square is one possible manifestation. The negative manifestation of that is the same thing, but attempts to use that to control and manipulate people through the releasing of like information for sort of nefarious purposes is like another possible manifestation.
Yeah, and there's also just the sometimes when when there's some investigation done and some awful truth comes out, it just sort of gives you sort of just a glimpse of what you know is a whole underlayer of corruption and horror, and you're like, oh yeah, that's out there just behind what I can see. The like in True Detective or like with a lot of this stuff, you're like, oh, we saw that piece, what other pieces don't we see? But
Yeah.
it's yeah, it's a thing. It's with Pluto's last station, it's such a like I find Pluto stations create like sort of sound this deep resonant ominous sort of bass note underneath everything, just like almost sub-audible, but like a little like an earthquake in the underworld that barely can be felt here, but nonetheless imbues an ominous vibration to things. And it's really it is its own event, like the station with the Mercury square. And I do think you're right. I think there'll be another disclosure of some another prominent disclosure of some point then. But it's so part of a sequence of things that's occurring this month and will go on beyond this month, but it's still part of the sequence of this month because while that's happening, the sun is on its way to a square with that Pluto. Mars is on its way to an opposition with that Pluto, and our full moon, which happens not that much, not that far into the future beyond this, is also going to be configured to that Pluto. And so it's, it's a bass note, but in a song that will go, that has been playing this month and will continue after this. It's when I joked question mark about the cardinal, what did I call it? The cardinal catastrophe last month. There's a lot more of that. Like the cardinal signs, and I speak as someone who has cardinal sign rising, are really getting it this month, and the Pluto station is just part of it.
Yeah, for sure. And because it's not just sometimes disclosures, but other times it's the attempt to suppress information and just to suppress disclosures
Hmm.
is like the flip side of that as well.
Yeah. And
Which
yeah,
is
yeah. Sorry, just to harken back to a much earlier point in this podcast, like Pluto either sends things to the underworld so nobody can see them, or disgorges the contents of what was hidden and secreted away. It loves to do both. It's like a doorway or a hellmouth.
yeah. And one last thing I missed last month when we were talking about Pluto and Capricorn making its final pass in Capricorn, as well as Uranus getting to the end of Taurus, is I didn't see the news that it was like Russia essentially functionally legalized cryptocurrencies and set that to go into effect on September 1st. And that was actually incredibly striking because September 1st was the day that Pluto retrograded back into Capricorn, and
Hmm.
also the same day that Uranus stationed at late Taurus at 27 degrees of Taurus, trining that. So some of those things that we were talking about happened in terms of how at the tail end of those two outer planet transits that have lasted for like a decade, you see this transformation of the way that money is handled and the way that stores of value are being handled in the world
Hmm.
by the tail end of that. And then, of course, as I've talked about a lot over the past few months, both candidates now have more or less endorsed cryptocurrency, which represents a huge reversal in terms of that. And yeah, well, it'll be interesting to see going forward because now with different countries legalizing it, it creates then more competition between the countries to be the ones who attempt to dominate that sphere, essentially.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it was and people can refer to our discussion about that last month. We're like, "Huh, that looks good for crypto." We sort of slowly we began with a few points and then sort of became increasingly interested and positive in what it might look like in September.
Yeah. So, all right. So that's the Mercury Pluto square. I'm not sure that's anything else to say about that. Is there anything else to say about Pluto stationing there? Just especially if you have planets late in that sign of Capricorn, you're getting the very last pass of a transit that you've been experiencing already off and on over the past couple of years, especially, and one last sort of burst of intensity in terms of that transit. But then by early next year, Pluto's in Aquarius and it's pretty much over for the most part. Um,
Oh,
so
yeah, I mean, by the second half of November, Pluto's back in Aquarius.
right.
It's so quick. This is literally the like Pluto's been Pluto entered into Capricorn in 2008. And we've been back and forth between Capricorn and Aquarius for this last year. But this is like right now, there are like 48 days of Pluto in Capricorn left.
I love it.
It
I love that as a 29-degree Cancer rising that you have you're like counting down the minutes and seconds until this transit's over.
it doesn't feel good, Chris. I can point
Okay.
to the meaningful transformations, and I'm glad those happened, but it felt fantastic to me the second Pluto moved into Aquarius. It felt like I was no longer carrying hell on my back. Like it's
Mm,
it like the lightness. The lightness, what is it? The completely bearable lightness of being that overcame me. I'm looking forward to it. But one last thing to do, one last like set of insights, lessons, one more big bass note from Pluto.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, and it's like for some people, that last pass is a transformational event in their life that will leave an imprint, like Diddy, for example, who's basically going to be in jail for the rest of his life, uh, even once this transit is over. And this was just like the turning point where he went from being a free person to being in jail. For other people, it's more like your experience of that long note and like feeling of the sort of transformative power of that that's somewhat unsettling. And then finally having that pass and having a feeling of like relief or of having finished a major chapter of your life and moved into a next.
Yeah, it feels um, like finishing a molting process, right? You know, if you look at the creatures that have to shed their exoskeletons, right? Like growth dictates that you have to lose all of your skin and grow a new shell. I'm sticking with Cancer rising, right? It's not
Right.
very comfortable. You feel vulnerable. It's awkward. It's not particularly attractive. But yeah, it feels like the new shell is just around the corner. New new exoskeleton, better adapted to the environment.
Yeah. Well, I like that interpretation because, of course, this month we're also all going to be holding our breath in terms of if that's also what America is going through and what the US looks like after this election. And once we complete this also being the final transit of Pluto return, of it returning back to where it started at the founding of the country in late Capricorn back in the 1770s and yeah, molting the shell and what exactly that looks like as we move into this new era that's going to last for not just the next 20 years of Pluto and Aquarius, but also the next, couple of centuries of Pluto doing another cycle around the zodiac for the country.
Yeah, it's interesting because you know when you think of like different nations, like you think of, let's say, France, you're like, well, France has been around for, much longer than the United States. What about their Pluto returns? However, very few countries actually have Pluto returns where they have like the same system of governance, the same constitutional rules. And so usually things have changed. Like there's been an overthrow, like there's been a revolution of some sort, or there's a completely different dynasty that seized power by the time you get to that 250-year mark. And so it's not really a Pluto return, right? Because this new, whatever the new like dynasty or form of governance is only 60 years old, even though the country's been around for much longer. Whereas the United States still has like a thankfully revised set of documents, but it's the same set of documents. And so the amount of research you can do is actually tiny because it's a very rare thing to have a country that has basically the same rules get a Pluto return. Does that make sense?
That does make sense. That is unfortunately also the scary thing about what's happening over the next few months and whether we will emerge from the last pass of this Pluto transit with the same country or with a radically changed one in terms of how our government works or is supposed to work or was set up to work at the foundation of it a few centuries ago. And that's a good
Yeah.
reminder. That's a good reminder everyone should vote in this election because it's going to make a big difference having this Pluto return and what the future of the country looks like as a result of the election.
Yeah. Well, and then we go right into coincidentally, uncoincidentally, we go right into the Uranus and Gemini period, which always remakes the United States. So,
Right.
yeah, fingers crossed.
Yeah. Um, all right. So that is the Pluto station that's happening in the middle of the month. And then in terms of other transits, let me pull up the planetary alignments calendar so we can situate ourselves. We get that Sun Mars square and Sun Jupiter trine on the 14th. And then we basically head into the next lunation of the month, which is that Aries full moon that takes place on the 17th. And normally we would sort of breathe a sigh of relief at this point that
Yeah.
we've moved out of the tumultuous eclipse season and we've moved back into like calmer waters. But instead, we get kind of a tense full
It's
moon.
it's more than kind of a tense full moon.
All right, I'm downplaying it like I usually do. We get a pretty rough full moon that basically sets us up for the second half of the month and for essentially the transit that we're going to be experiencing for the rest of the year, which is the Mars-Pluto opposition. So this full moon takes place here around the 17th of October. We can see it going exact around 24 degrees of Aries. And what sucks about this full moon is when it goes exact at 24, it's just barely coming off of a square with Mars at 22 degrees of Cancer. And then it applies next to a square with Pluto at 29 degrees of Capricorn. So part of what this also means is that by the time we get to the second half of the month, the Mars-Pluto opposition starts coming into a close degree-based orb and starts becoming very potent and very powerful and becomes the dominant aspect that we're basically going to be experiencing for the rest of the year because Mars is going to slow down and station in early Leo and then retrograde back into that opposition a couple more times. So this lunation really kicks that off by um, emphasizing and by squaring both of those two planets as they come into alignment.
Yeah, it's super tense. It's combustible. The if we look at like what's angular to the sun and the moon, right? Like there's it's just all malefics, right? It's the nodes, it's Mars, it's Pluto. And so yes, it's a full the silver of the moon is restored, right? No blood-stained moon, no eclipse. But it's very intense. And it's also worth noting that it's an Aries moon, so it's ruled by that Mars. And the Mars and the moon are
Mm.
actually a mutual reception. And so, something to think about not just for this moon, but that I believe I advised last month, and I'll double down on, is pay attention to Mars in Cancer as it's kind of getting ready to do all the things that it's going to do, because we're going to have a very extended, you're going to have a lot of Mars in Cancer. And so ignoring the itch until it becomes overwhelmingly painful is not the advice, right? You want to go to the doctor as soon as there's some burning and inflammation. Like pay attention to what issues, even if they're small, that Mars is stirring up in your life, in your chart, and treat them with special care, right? And keep an eye on it so that you're not surprised if things go from like kind of a problem to a big issue. Because what Mars is doing right now at the beginning of the month and at the beginning of the month could very well could very well get much worse. And so nipping things in the bud or keeping an eye on them is good practice. Because again, it's the punch you don't see coming that knocks you out. And so keeping an eye on what Mars is doing will be to pretty much everyone's benefit.
Yeah. Um, and it really brings the Mars Pluto into alignment, which I'm going to animate the chart for those watching the video version. We just see inching closer and closer by the end of the month until by the time we close October on like the 31st on Halloween, Mars is at 28 degrees of Cancer, opposing Pluto at 29 Capricorn. And then, of course, that opposition goes exact here around November 3rd, just before Election Day. So that's going to become, unfortunately, one of our primary signatures for Election Day. So given that, we kind of have to just talk about this opposition and its symbolic significance because that's going to become the dominant energy late in the month, especially from the time of this full moon on the 17th forward. So some of the keywords, one of the keywords that came up like a year over the past year that you mentioned, Austin, about Pluto and Mars is just annihilation.
Yeah.
Like Mars has this basic concept of like severing and separation and like cutting through things. Um, and sometimes that can be good, sometimes that can be bad. It also has this reputation for like Mars is the classic significator of like violence and aggression and things like that, or even sometimes violence being done to people. But Pluto has this basic function of taking things to the utmost extreme and taking something small and then just making it huge. Alan White always used that example of like a mushroom cloud where it starts with an atom and then all of a sudden it blows up into this huge explosion. And that concept of like of annihilation just becomes a really good keyword for Mars Pluto because of that tendency to take the violence of Mars and just take it to its utmost possible extreme. So go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, Mars is a malefic. Mars is an asshole. Mars is violent. But when it's just Mars, usually what you're looking at is like somebody who wants to beat people up and be dominant over them, right? Or like somebody who wants to win, who is maybe over prioritizes winning, and that's obnoxious. But when we're bringing like Pluto, that taking it to an extreme, it's somebody dying in the boxing ring rather than just getting beat up. It's like suddenly it's Mortal Kombat and the crowd is yelling finish him, and instead of being in an aggressive spectacle, it feels like you're like somehow now we're in hell, right?
Right.
And there it's like a there's a it's not just being the victor, right? Like usually there are contests and people get hurt in contests, but like going that bridge too far is something that Pluto brings out. And
Yeah.
conversely, like the uh, conversely, you think about with Mars as fight or flight, the natural sort of rise. The a person's natural desire to protect themselves when you feel like you're facing not just aggression or dominance, but annihilation, right? That back against the wall feeling, like there, you also get, like that is also a different thing than just trying to defend yourself. And so you get these very extreme cycles, which, yeah, anyway.
Right, like what a person does when they are facing like an existential threat and going to all um lengths, but sometimes overreactions, like going too far. I'm glad you used that keyword because that's a major one with Mars Pluto. Some of the other keywords I was writing down were things like power struggles, power
Yeah.
plays, acts of extreme violence, aggression, confrontations, but also issues with like manipulation, control, having protracted conflicts in which both sides vie for supremacy, but also for survival. Having an intense burning sensation or a smoldering sense of anger, lashing out at perceived enemies, sometimes overtly and other times covertly. Other things are like ruthlessness, and forcefulness. And then we talked in previous months about sometimes how Mars Pluto can act like openly and obviously and just like going too far on a massive scale. But also sometimes Pluto likes to control things from behind the scenes and can sometimes represent the exercise of power that is hidden and not overt, or that like looks like it's coming from one place, but then instead it's coming from another place. And that's going to be one of the tricky things about navigating this during this retrograde, because we're not just going to get one of these aspects, we're going to get three of them. So it's almost like the same note on a musical instrument being just drawn out over the course of several months of this same energy. And unfortunately, especially for us in the US, that energy is going to be very much tied in with the election, with and everything subsequent to the election between then and inauguration day, and even potentially beyond that when we're still in this range of these two planets being in this close aspect together.
Yeah, we don't get our final Mars Pluto opposition until April, which is wild.
That is crazy.
But yeah, the speaking to we were saying about, so sometimes it's very overt, it's very obvious Mars Pluto, like the someone dies in the ring, or like overt acts of terror or violence. But then there's the suspiciously weirdly quiet side, because Pluto again will show you has such things to show you and will disgorge things that were hidden before, but then also will conceal things that are very big and important. And so that there you get into all of the like what is going on behind the scenes, right? In a relationship between people, Diddy is an excellent example, right? Up till very recently, up till earlier this year, all of that stuff was under, was beneath the ground, right? That was like happening, but in the underworld, nobody could see it, and you couldn't hear it. Like there were rumors about this and that, but it was hidden. And so with the Mars Pluto opposition and oppositions in general, there's sort of a back and forth. And we have Pluto again, like hyper revealing, but also concealing. And the fact that this isn't one Mars Pluto opposition, but one of a series suggests that we're going to get both of those. And also, Pluto, because of that concealing quality, is confusing, right? It's confusing for Mars. Like, I don't know, am I facing annihilation? Am I just super overreacting? Is there stuff going on? It can be very paranoia inducing because it's Pluto, so you can't see things clearly. Half of it is concealed.
Right. Yeah, I remember under like Jupiter Pluto alignment, sometimes there can be the explosion of like conspiracy theories and stuff like that that we experienced a few years ago. But with this, sometimes it's almost like that of the paranoia element and the conspiracy theory element, but that then also leads to action or leads to negative repercussions in some sense. I did half of a study. I didn't finish doing it, but I was going through and looking at dates of past Mars Pluto oppositions, and I was very disturbed by the number of like explosions and especially like terrorist type incidents that were occurring under some of the previous ones. There was also sometimes instances of the disclosure of horrific acts of violence, like back in the 2004 late April Mars Pluto opposition. The Abu Ghraib torture and prisoner abuse scandal broke in the United States when CBS News
Mm.
published the first photographs of the US Army committing these like horrific acts of abuse on Iraqi prisoners. So sometimes you've got stuff like that where it's like the awareness of things like that coming to the public attention.
Yeah. And also, so we do have one okay, like reasonable precedent for Mars retrograding opposite Pluto three times. And that was the final Q4 of 2007 and then into Q1 of 2008. We had Mars oppose Pluto three times. It was in Gemini and Capricorn. So it was interesting that Pluto's movement into Capricorn was actually accompanied by a trio of Mars oppositions as well. And
Mhm.
so that was drawing from that. That was not great for the economies of many nations. And then sort of going, sort of time traveling back there for just sort of the flavor, right? The Mars Pluto also just gave a feeling of doom, right? It was like, oh, like this whole thing is fucked. How far is the market gonna fall? Like the Mars Pluto, just like, oh, things are doomed. Mars opposite Pluto, there's nothing that can be done, right? Mars is that can be that like sparky, plucky individual force, and Pluto is just this collective, or historical tide that you can't do anything about. The feeling of which, right, is like, oh, it's doom. Like there's nothing that can be done, and that wasn't the end of all things, right? But just kind of thinking about what that felt like for a lot of people.
Yeah, for sure. I was listening to a podcast recently of like a comedian, Michelle Wolf, who said she was working at like Bear Stearns like during the 2008 collapse, and
Ooh.
then that bank just like ceased to exist. It was just absolutely wiped out after that. And some people had who worked for it, they were encouraged to like put their retirement into stock for the company. so that it wasn't just that they lost their job, but it was that their entire life savings got wiped out when this company crashed and the stock dropped to zero. So that's another example of just sometimes like extremes of the difference between like, losing your job and that really sucks versus losing your entire life savings and everything you've built up over a several decade long period of work.
Yeah, that's a heart-wrenching and good example, right? Like it would be if you lost half of what you'd saved over 20 years in 1 month, that would be devastating. But just to have it gone, right? Like
Right.
that annihilate again, like instead of pain, loss, whatever, just annihilation. It's just not there anymore.
Yeah. So, we have a lot of concerns about how this is going to play out in terms of mundane stuff, in terms of the election, and conflicts probably presumably related to the results. It's really weird that Mars stations in early December around the time that the votes are being certified, essentially. And then there's also some stuff in early January. So I'm sure this is going to lead to a protracted, probably conflict about some of the things related to the election and the outcome of it. But on a
Yeah, it's just so hard to imagine that there were like that voting happens, they're counted, there's a result, and we move forward with the astrology. I would be so excited if that was the case, but it's just so hard to square the astrology with that sort of clean and clear result.
Yeah. One and the other reason for that is like Mars goes into Leo right before election day, and that's Trump's rising sign. So it's like we're looking at a very long transit of Mars going retrograde in Trump's first house with the election. And that just sounds like him raging and being angry about something. So that one of the scenarios, of course, is if he loses the election, he will say that it was stolen, which is what he did last time. So whether we have this huge, like protracted conflict in the country about him claiming that the election was stolen, and then whether there's a peaceful transfer of power and all that other stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, there are a lot of possibilities, and I'm not particularly excited about 95% of them.
Right, for sure. A lot of possible scenarios. On a personal level, though, to try to relate this to individual listeners outside of the mundane astrology, potential terrible repercussions in a world stage, how should we relate this to people? Let's say, like, best case scenario for a Mars Pluto alignment that's taking place over the course of months is maybe having an extreme period of physical or even mental exertion that pushes you to your absolute limits, but in which you accomplish like more than you even thought possible to accomplish during that period of time, I think is one of the more positive ways I could see that manifesting.
Yeah, although um I would be careful about sort of advising people to push towards what seems like annihilation. I've been thinking about this one a lot because I have a 29 Cancer, 29 Capricorn ascendant descendant axis, right? Like this, and I'm in a Mars ruled year. So, like that opposition that we're talking about is by degree on my ascendant and descendant. And so I've been thinking about that for over a year now. And so one, I don't think that I'm going to be annihilated on on November 3rd. Um, I do think that it will be challenging, right? With the as I've been trying to say about Mars, like with Mars, like with the Mars and Cancer, it looks like if it's relationships with people, like friends, family, lovers, whatever, like it's a bunch of negative feelings getting stirred up. It's people's feeling threatened and insecure, like and handling those feelings in a way that doesn't make the conflicts worse if it's in your first house or if it's afflicting the ruler of the ascendant. It's watching yourself and watching your own reactions. So if you get attacked or you feel attacked, you don't react in such a way that like you're creating the like that you're feeding into a Mars Pluto doom spiral. Just being thoughtful and knowing that there are negative options on offer, and that there may be things that you have no control over, but there probably are a lot of things that you do have some ability to steer around. And yeah, being aware of of what that Mars trigger looks like, and how to not not make it worse by reacting to it, because that's a huge difficulty that Mars in Cancer brings. Is it tends to react to something negative happening in a way that makes the negative thing worse rather than fixing it.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And because Pluto's tough because sometimes you get swept up in events that are outside of your control and you have
Sure.
to learn. It's very humbling. Like Pluto transits can be very humbling because you have those experience of going through events where maybe you don't have power to change the outcome. And so you have to learn to accept whatever that is, even if it's something that you really don't like. But with the Mars part of that, maybe a good meditation throughout this is just to control those things that you can control, while at the same time learning to accept those things that are outside of your power or where you're just in the midst of getting swept up in history, but you still have some control over your immediate environment or your immediate sort of emotional reaction to everything that's swirling around you.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think that during periods, I mean, literally, there's no period of life where there aren't things out of your control that are important. We're never in total control. But at some points, we have noticeably less than normal, and that can that very easily triggers a panic or fear response. And so, remembering the things that are in your control and giving Mars something to do, right? Mars is not a planet that it's not a part of us or a planet that likes to feel powerless. And so remembering those things which are controllable, or where we can make a difference, even if it's remembering to exercise in the evening, even if everything else is going crazy and you can't do anything about it. Like having some place to put in an effort that makes a positive difference can be very sustaining mentally during difficult times.
Yeah, that's a really great piece of advice. Um, all right, other things for Mars Pluto oppositions. I'm trying to think about personal advice or other mundanes that things we want to say about that. I did have a few other like minor transits this month I wanted to mention.
Yeah, I don't think, yeah, I don't have anything more to say about that opposition right now. Again, we're going to be in conversation about this dynamic for the next several months,
Yeah,
several, and then several after that. It's part of the background for a while.
for sure. Yeah, so we will revisit that. All right. Well, part of what I wanted to mention, I was trying to look this month to see, since this is October in an election year, if there was some sort of like October surprise, when would that happen? And especially if there were any Uranus signatures this month, which Uranus, an October surprise is not always something that comes out of nowhere and is just absolutely shocking. So it doesn't have to be your Uranian thing, but if there was some Uranian thing this month, a couple of the transits where Uranus does get hit, the one that seemed the most notable was at the very end of the month when Mercury opposes Uranus on October 30th. So let me show that. And that's pretty late typically for an October surprise. Typically they happen a little earlier in the month, although I guess we did have the Hillary emails thing where the FBI announced that probably pretty late in October last time. So here we see Mercury on October 30th at 25 degrees of Scorpio, opposing Uranus at 25 Taurus. So sometimes that can just be like a shocking or surprising piece of news comes out of nowhere and causes tension or causes upset around that time as one possibility, both in terms of world events as well as just in terms of personal events, especially if somebody has something around 25 degrees of the fixed signs. One other transit I saw with Uranus this month is earlier in the month on the 14th, the same day virtually that the sun squares Mars and the sun trines Jupiter, Venus actually opposes Uranus on October 14th. So here's what that looks like. So we kind of need to layer that into our delineation to some extent, that the same day that we have this very tense square between the sun and Mars, with Jupiter attempting to counterbalance with a positive thing, there's also something like shocking or surprising that's happening at the same time, with Venus hitting 26 degrees of Taurus or 26 degrees of Scorpio and opposing Uranus at 26 degrees of Taurus. And that's especially one that's sort of surprising things in terms of interpersonal relationships and different things in that category or that area. But sometimes it can be just surprising things in general.
Yeah, I think yeah, so that Venus opposition that you're highlighting as well as the later Mercury opposition definitely bring that potential to for surprise to the forefront. Um it's also true that our growing Mars-Pluto opposition is also both Mars and Pluto are relatively tightly aspected to Uranus. And so Uranus is going to kind of get folded. They're going to be like little surprise shock elements that get folded into that Mars Pluto. And that's just kind of true for the whole second half plus of the month, with those stress points that you point out with Venus or with Venus and then Mercury making an exact opposition to Pluto, while Venus is also aspecting trying to Mars sextile to Pluto. We have so much action happening at the very end of water and earth signs.
Right. I just realized it's like Mercury's at 1 degree of Scorpio this day. So that's the same degree as Kamala Harris's Mercury, which is the ruler of her ascendant. So the news is probably something surrounding her that day.
Yeah,
Um,
I don't have any specific idea or prediction, but it is worth noting that that kind of wild full moon is her natal sun and moon. She was a full moon in Aries with the sun in Libra.
right. And that's also around the time of her um, solar return, since she was born on October 20th. So she switches actually from a 12th house profection year, which is Taurus, to a first house profection year, which is Gemini, on her solar return on October 20th.
Interesting.
Yeah, where the moon is also transiting through Gemini and applying to that Jupiter. It's actually one of the, if you break it down, it's one of the tricky things about analyzing the transits, because she's getting that activated with that Jupiter transit near her ascendant in the first house, in a first house perfection year at the election, while Trump, of course, famously has his sun very close to there, in Gemini, and his sun is the ruler of the ascendant. So there's kind of a toss up when it comes to some of the transits there, and which, whether it comes out in favor of one of them when it comes to just that single analysis.
Yeah.
All right. Let me see. Other things. Venus gets out of Scorpio and goes into Sagittarius on October 17th, which is kind of nice, although then
I
it start
Yeah, go ahead. I think it's kind of nice too.
Okay, well, it's nice, but then it also starts heading into a square with Saturn. It's got to get through this square with Saturn, which goes exact on October 28th first, which is a little bit of a downer and a little bit of pouring, cold water on Venus's otherwise like Sagittarius fire party once she departs from Scorpio.
Yeah, what I like about Venus moving into Sagittarius is that it puts Venus in a whole sign opposition to Jupiter. So it's Jupiter and Venus looking across the sky at each other. We like configured benefics. And it's Venus in a Jupiter ruled sign, staring right at Jupiter. And it would just be lovely, if not for having to complete the square with Saturn first. Um,
Right.
After Venus clears that, it's actually a nice silver or like coppery lining to the very difficult or very tense end of the month, beginning of next month. Um, but at least it's not opposite Uranus and configured with Pluto and Mars. And I'll take the shift into Sagittarius, especially the second half of that journey.
Yeah, totally. It's one of the few saving graces about election day is that there's this very close not like super close, but Venus and Jupiter are pretty close to an opposition. So it'll be interesting that when one of them is rising over the horizon that day, the other one will be setting. And that's one of the cool things about opposition. So that opposition is a little bit positive in terms of offsetting the Mars-Pluto opposition that's happening at the same time. Um,
And nice for mutable planets. You know, cardinal planets are still going to be having a time, but for mutable placements, that's double benefics.
yeah. So positive things for people with mutable rising, especially or planets around those degrees. But there is this one day towards the end of the month where Venus at about 12, 13 degrees of Sagittarius hits a square with Saturn, and there may be some tensions in terms of interpersonal relationships and in terms of feeling like a cooling off or feeling colder towards somebody on that day, or having um balancing the sense of like romance with the sense of not just obligation, but also the practical numbers of like whether a relationship adds up or makes sense is something that people sometimes experience under hard aspects between Venus and Saturn. And it gets accentuated that day by the moon swooping through Virgo and forming a T square with Venus and Saturn.
Yeah, yeah, and you have some frustration there, right? Where it feels like, oh, they're all, you should be having a double benefic party, but like Saturn must be appeased, right? And sometimes that's through hearing out that this isn't, hearing Saturn out, and they're like, no, this isn't realistic, or yeah, this nice thing can happen, but you're going to have to wait a little bit, or you're going to have to consider the cost. There's a Saturn, even when Saturn's being helpful, there's a like coming down to earth and yeah, there's a coldness and a hardness to Saturn, which might be helpful, but is not fun. It doesn't keep the party going.
Yeah, I like that. It's like a toll booth that Venus has to pay in order to get to Jupiter.
Yeah. But at least there's the Jupiter aspect on the other side.
Right, exactly. And it's just a fleeting aspect, unlike some of the other aspects this month, but still worth noting. Speaking of that, I did want to mention our auspicious electional chart for this month. It's kind of hard. Lisa and I just did the Electional Astrology podcast for October and tried to find the best dates, but with all of these difficult alignments happening with like eclipse season and all the Mars stuff at the beginning of the month, and then the Mars-Pluto opposition towards the end of the month, it's actually pretty tricky. But our auspicious election for this month, the best date we can find if you do have to do something or launch something important, takes place around this time on October 25th. And there's a few different rising signs that you could use this day, but the one I like the most is Aquarius rising, which occurs around 3 p.m. local time. Whatever your location is, just set it for your city and set it for about 3 p.m. And if you do, you should end up with a chart that has Aquarius rising. And what you should do is you should adjust the ascendant until the ascendant is at about 20 degrees of Aquarius in your location. So this is the chart that you'll end up with roughly. You'll have a chart with Aquarius rising. The ruler of the ascendant is Saturn in Pisces in the second whole sign house in a day chart, showing kind of a focus on financial matters for this chart, which is pretty good. Um, the moon is in Leo and it's applying to a sextile with Jupiter, which is helping to affirm the moon and indicate positive things coming up in the future, as long as you can catch that as an applying aspect. If you can't catch it in your time zone, like if you're on the West Coast, for example, of the US, you might be able to back the chart up a day and still get something pretty decent with the moon applying to Jupiter. So I picked this specific time because if you pick 20 degrees of Aquarius, you can get a nice supportive and protective trine from Jupiter in Gemini down there in the fifth house. And that's a pretty good, especially for like creativity and other things related to the fifth house, which can also include fun and games and leisurely activities. We also see that Venus is up there in the 11th whole sign house. In our location, we also adjusted the time in order to put Venus not too far off from the midheaven. So if you're able to accomplish that in your location, that would be great. Or although if you can't, it's not a huge deal. But Venus up there in the 11th house is doing pretty well for friends, groups, and alliances, especially being ruled by Jupiter. And since Venus is applying to the square with Saturn, but Saturn is the ruler of the ascendant, that overcoming square from Venus actually becomes helpful in terms of helping to affirm and support the ruler of the ascendant, which represents you in the chart and what you're initiating and starting at this time. So the area of major difficulty in the chart, of course, is Mars in Cancer in the sixth house of work and health at 26 degrees of Cancer, and it's applying to that opposition with Pluto in the 12th house of self-undoing enemies and isolation. So, it's not great. I'm not going to lie. I wouldn't normally, if this was like a huge thing, like try to schedule something for a close Mars-Pluto opposition. However, if you have to, this is the best chart that I can come up with in order to squeeze the best energy out of some of these alignments that are happening, the most positive alignments that are happening this month, and in order to try to mitigate some of the most challenging alignments that are happening. I think this is the best I can come up with. So yeah, that's our auspicious electional chart for this month for October. We found something like 15 other electional charts on different days throughout the course of the month, which we released in our Electional Astrology podcast through our page on Patreon just a few days ago. So if you're looking for other dates this month besides just this one on the 25th, you can access those through our page at patreon.com/astrology podcast. All right. And that is our best chart for the month. You said you used Aquarius rising recently for something?
Yeah, during the Leo moon a few days ago.
Nice. Nice. Exactly. Yeah, just like our electional chart. It reminds me of just like the best part of J.K. Rowling's chart, which is, Aquarius rising, Saturn in the second house in Pisces, ruled by Jupiter in the fifth house, and becoming a billionaire by writing like children's books. And that part of the chart that's relatively successful or positive, but not necessarily the rest of it. So that's part of what you're going for there with a chart like this.
Yeah, there's a lot that works there.
Speaking of, did you see, this was really funny on September 4th, Martin, what's his name? Game of Thrones author?
Oh, George R. R. Martin.
George R. R. Martin like wrote a scathing blog post like criticizing the showrunners of House of Dragon for deviating from what he wrote in his book in the script for what they ended up putting up on the show. And that was the day that Mars ingressed into Cancer, which is his third house. So he's
And
having a third house transit.
yeah, and it conjoined his natal Uranus there.
Right.
So he
Yeah.
has Uranus there, and then Mars hits it. Yeah, and then freaks out. Blog is totally a third house thing.
Totally.
We didn't talk about this ahead of time, but I also I read it before they took it down.
Well, yeah,
Um,
because he pulled it down because
mhm.
probably he was breaking a bunch of like agreements and other things with like HBO, I'm sure, to not criticize the show. It was actually very surprising because he doesn't usually, even if he's not happy with stuff, he doesn't usually openly criticize it.
Yeah, and it was very it was very Mars Cancer in the sense of like finally like reacting after how after feelings had been building up for him for probably 10 years, right? And it just so happened that Mars ingress into Cancer hitting the Uranus was the straw that broke the camel's back, and then taking it back right away. But it's sometimes it's increasingly it is harder to unsay things, right? When people can screen cap it and share it, et cetera, et cetera. I also thought it was sort of a master class in passive aggression, which Mars and Cancer can be
Yeah,
um,
definitely.
guilty of slash also be a champion of.
Yeah, other Mars and Cancer champions. I think the avatar of Mars and Cancer of the past month has been this baby pygmy hippo in Thailand called Moo Deng. Uh, she was born back in like July with the Sun and Venus, I think, in Cancer. But for some reason, this hippo just went viral over the course of the past month. as soon as Mars went into Cancer in early September, and it's actually been really funny to watch. She was just parodied on like SNL like just a few nights ago, even.
Yeah, that's really funny. It's extra funny for Kate and I because we've been talking about Lucian in pachyderm analogies for a month or two now. He's a very large child. Um, and so literally like we call him the flippo because he's always flipping around on the bed. And he's mobile. He's not crawling, but he's like rolling to get places dangerously so. So we talk about the flippopotamus. He's a pachyderm. We talk about him as the attachoderm, because he's an Aries. But anyway, and so famous baby hippo, we're like, oh, it's just something in the air. Adorable, aggressive pachyderms.
Exactly. Yeah, so people have to check that out. I don't know why it's happening, but it just seems Mars and Cancer to me, which is pretty funny.
Well, it's like adorable, but like kind of potentially Marsy and dangerous. Because I mean, even a tiny hippo is a large creature, right? Like the pygmy hippopotamus, like his mom is still like larger than a bull. Um, and
Right.
hippos actually, I believe on the statistics, like hippos hurt a lot more people per year than crocodiles. Like they're really dangerous animals. And
Right.
so to
That
have something dangerous in adorable baby form is very Mars and Cancer.
Yeah, it's just an adorable baby version of that though that like chomps on your knee, but it doesn't really do anything.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So we will leave you all with that as the imagery for Mars and Cancer to
That's
balance
right.
out our earlier treatment. But I think that's it for this forecast this month. I think we covered everything pretty comprehensively here as much as we could. We'll see how world events play out with the rest of eclipse season, and then we'll start experiencing the Mars-Pluto at the end of the month, and then we will return again next month. Actually, that's really funny. We're going to have to do the next episode like right as that aspect's going very close at the end of October. So we will definitely be revisiting Mars-Pluto by the end of the month.
Yeah. Hopefully I don't get annihilated on camera.
Yeah. I'm gonna annihilate some nachos after recording this episode is my is my plan. So, all right, my friend, good job today. What do you have
Thank
coming up
you.
this month? What are you working on? What do you have happening?
Okay, so I'm just working on all my normal things. You can see some of the things I've done before. I've got I've got, I don't know, 100 hours worth of different recorded workshops and classes. I've done available for download on my website. Um, I'm not personally taking readings right now, but on my website you can also find the graduates from my program who know how to do a bunch of the stuff I know how to do. And then Sphere and Sundry actually closed between the eclipses. They got overwhelmed by the sale that was announced last month, but will be reopening right after the solar eclipse. The sale is back on, and there's going to be a beautiful, extremely benefic solar series that is going to debut this month as a counterpoint to to all of the rather yeah, the rather unshiny, unfresh configurations. So look for the Golden Soul announcement and look for Sphere and Sundry to reopen shortly after the eclipse.
Nice. Excellent. That's exciting. Cool. And as for myself, I spent a good chunk of the past few weeks researching the third house for the next installment of my houses series. And Lisa and I did a huge, intensive amount of research on that. And we ended up recording our episode on the third house already. We have over 108 examples in that episode. It's so extensive, but we found so many good charts of third house placements. It's really incredible. One of my favorite was it turns out that Billie Eilish has a mutual reception between the ruler of the 10th house of career and the third house of siblings. And she famously, her brother, they work together basically and have produced and won a bunch of awards together for their collaborations. So we found a ton of great examples like that and have already released that, and it's available for early access through our page on Patreon. It's a very long episode because I decided to make it my definitive treatment of the third house. So as a result of that, it's actually going to take me a while to edit and then release. I may not release it until sometime mid to late October, possibly. We'll have to see if I can find a good election before then, but it will be available for early access to all patrons. And then once I do release it to the public, for patrons, I'm going to release a 75-page ebook as a bonus that will be available just to patrons, which will contain all of our notes that we did in researching the episode, as well as charts, and it will contain a bunch of examples that we didn't get to include just because of cutting them out for time purposes for the purpose of the episode. So that'll be available on Patreon. And then I'm already starting to research and work on the fourth house. And we'll see if I'm able to record that at some point later in the month, if we're able to get it all together at some point in October.
Yeah, love those. Love the encyclopedic style work.
Yeah, I like doing definitive things and like raising the bar on astrological research. And I think Lisa and I were able to definitely do this in this episode. So I'm excited to share it with everybody.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think that's it. Thanks everyone for watching or listening to this episode. Thanks to the live audience of patrons that joined us in the live chat throughout the course of this. It's been really fun seeing all of the comments and talking with everybody. And I think that's it for this forecast. So thanks a lot for watching. We will see you again next month. Good luck with all of the different transits. And otherwise, good luck and take care. And we'll see you again for our next forecast at the end of October. All right. Have a good one.
Bye.
If you're a fan of the podcast and you'd like to support the production of future episodes, then consider becoming a patron through my page on patreon.com. In exchange, you'll get access to a bunch of benefits, such as early access to new episodes, the ability to attend live recordings, access to the monthly Electional Astrology Podcast, access to another exclusive podcast called the Secret Astrology Podcast that's only available to patrons, or even get your name listed in the credits at the end of each episode. For more information, visit patreon.com/astrologypodcast. Special thanks to patrons on our producers tier, including Christy Moe, Ariana Amour, Mandy Ray, Angelique Nambo, Issa Sabah, Jeannie Marie Kaplan, Melissa Delano, Sunny Bozboz, Kwatsi Alibarahu, and Annie Newman. If you're looking for an astrological consultation, then we have a new list of recommended astrologers on the podcast website. These astrologers offer birth chart readings, synastry, rectification, electional astrology, horary questions, and more. Go to theastrologypodcast.com/consultations. The astrology software that we use on the Astrology Podcast is called Solar Fire for Windows, and you can get a 15% discount on the software by using the promo code AP15 when you purchase it through alabe.com. For Mac users, we recommend the program Astro Gold for Mac OS, and you can also get a 15% discount when you use the promo code AstroPodcast15 at the website astrogold.io. If you'd like to learn more about my approach to astrology, then you should get a copy of my book titled Hellenistic Astrology, The Study of Fate and Fortune, which is available in both print and now ebook forms, where I've started selling a PDF copy of the book through my website at HellenisticAstrology.com/book. If you're really looking to deepen your studies of astrology, then check out my Hellenistic Astrology course, which is an online course in ancient astrology. It's perfect for beginner and intermediate students because I take people from basic concepts up through intermediate and advanced techniques for reading birth charts. There's over 100 hours of video lectures, including monthly webinars and Q&A sessions. And at the end of the course, if you complete the final test, you'll receive a certificate of completion saying that you studied with me. You can find out more information at theastrologyschool.com.